This meeting is being recorded.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And on the program tonight, this has been this one has been a long time coming. We welcome first-time guest Chris Richards, the host of the Eclectic Radical. The Eclectic Radical is a brilliant, underrated, and criminally overlooked left-wing podcast. It's anti-racist, it's anti-xenophobic, it's anti-heteronormative, it's anti-patriarchy, anti-misogynistic, and also anti-imperialist. And Chris, he's not afraid to call out fellow leftists, especially those who fail to uphold what should be universal leftist values. And his show is often also tackling subjects even the best of the left overlooks, like anti-ableism, disability rights, the calls for the legalization, decriminalization of sex work. And if you like pop culture, comic books, and you're a film buff, and just in general a history buff, the Eclectic Radical offers all of that and more from a critical leftist perspective. And before I welcome him, just a reminder, folks, to please donate if you can to 1+1. And if you want to donate, if you can donate by PayPal and you want to donate a different way, then email me at yurismart@gmail.com. And again, please share widely all of 1+1's content. Help us overcome the far-right algorithms and the monopoly that corporate and Western state media has in the social media world by, again, sharing 1+1 widely. And sometimes Facebook blocks me from sharing my content. So again, please share widely. And now on to the topic at hand. First off, Chris, welcome to the show. First time on the show on 1+1.
Well, I'm glad that I'm able to make it. I always have trouble scheduling appearances on other people's shows the way I want to, but I was able to get it done this week. So thanks for having me.
Well, it's an honor to finally have you. And Chris, I think well, actually, my first official question I wanted to ask you is, before we get a bit into your background and some of the many topics that you do explore on the Eclectic Radical that I want to get into, the first, I did want to ask this question, which is, what do you think it's going to take the broad people power movements in the U.S., whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's eco-socialists, whether it's feminists, whether it's workers' rights, whether it's Palestine solidarity activists, whether it's even just the anti-imperialist movement alone, what do you think it's going to take the broad left in the U.S. to show more earth and solidarity to the plight of Native Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and Indigenous Alaskans?
I mean, we need an actual movement, for one thing. The number one problem in the United States is that there is a quote-unquote progressive movement that is associated with the Democratic Party and a smaller eco-socialist or sort of Soviet communist alternative, but these are electoral parties that don't really do the kind of large-scale organizing they should be. They try, they do good organizing. There is good organizing that happens, but we don't really have a large mass movement where everybody is on the same page and holding huge events like you had in, say, the 60s or parts of the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
There is no... I hate to give one group of white people at one university too much credit, but there is no sort of core group like Students for a Democratic Society going out and radicalizing other people so that they can then create their own groups. Because, I mean, one of the reasons that there was this left movement in the 60s is that Students for a Democratic Society, whatever else you want to say or think of them, was going out from the University of Chicago into urban Chicago around them and talking with working class people in Black communities and Puerto Rican communities and depressed white communities about socialism and political organizing, not to try to recruit them into Students for a Democratic Society because they weren't students, but to put them in a position to create local community-driven movements in their own communities. And this is what, and I mean, not everybody who was involved in the national Black Panthers was involved in this, but Fred Hampton, who started the Chicago branch of the Panthers, had specifically attended one of these Students for a Democratic Society workshop, where he specifically met people like High Brown, I think I'm getting the last name wrong, but the future founders of groups like the Young Patriots and the Young Lords, because they all attended these workshops. They spoke to the SDS people, and they met each other, and they were in a strong position to then link their organizing to each other in a broader way once they believed they had their own organizations moving on a steady and stable basis.
Okay.
We don't have the only people who are going out and sort of trying to teach socialism on a fundamental level and organize in your own neighborhood level. I mean, well, nobody is. Everybody is sort of teaching socialism on a join us level, whether it's the PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation, whether it's Democratic Socialists of America, whether it's the Socialist Equality Party or other Trotskyist groups. Everybody is sort of teaching socialism on a what we believe is socialism join us level, as opposed to this is what socialism is, go organize in your community level.
Interesting. And
now, that's my perception. I could be wrong. There may be a lot more outreach by a lot more groups than I'm aware of. But the perception is that rather than any sort of movement building, we have a lot of organizations that are trying to build their organizations into a movement.
And you think that's where, and do you think until there's a little bit of changing of that policies, there will be more urgent.
I think you need. I think it's
Indigenous Hawaiians, Indigenous Alaskans.
I think it's ridiculous to expect forward movement on socialist political organizing in the West, as long as everybody cares first and foremost about this identity badge that says I'm a Marxist-Leninist, I'm a Trotskyist, or I'm a Maoist, or I'm a Dengist, or whatever it says.
Go on.
I think there needs to. I mean, the success of the 1917 and the success of the first revolution in Russia, the one that ended up with a liberal democratic government taking power, was that all of these groups were able to work together to overthrow the Tsar and to maintain some common unity against any return to monarchy. Now, as soon as some of these groups started peeling off and joining the Tsar, you start to see what we would consider Marxist-Leninism take place as things go on. But even really then, it's revolution, counter-revolution, revolution again, counter-revolution again. They're just these patterns, and ultimately people got a little tired and were willing to let Stalin sort of do a little counter-revolution in ways that would sort of compromise with the liberal order and give everyone a rest. But Stalin's attempts to compromise with the liberal order didn't benefit Stalin nearly as much as they benefited the liberal order. And, you know, the USSR ends up fighting a war for the safety and success of the liberal world, ultimately. And I'm not saying that Hitler didn't need to be defeated. He absolutely did. But I'm saying that when we talk about how the Soviet Union defeated Hitler, it's very important to understand that because of the way that the build-up to World War II happened, and then the way World War II itself happened, rather than really defending itself against a capitalist assault, the Soviet Union was making a series of compromises with the West and then with Nazi Germany to try to avoid this inevitable war with Nazi Germany until it was unavoidable.
Although I would say in Stalin's defense,
at which point, what we ultimately see is a war in which the Soviet Union is rebuffed by the West until fighting has actually started and the Soviet Union is invaded and therefore needs help. And then the West is able to give help to the Soviet Union and dictate its own terms for that help. And then ultimately you end up with a war in which the Soviet Union defeats Nazi Germany for the benefit of the liberal West, in many ways to the detriment of the Soviet Union in the long term.
Interesting. That's an interesting perspective. But anywho,
then you have a post-war order in which the USSR is initially assumed to act as a cooperative partner, and the USSR believes that the West will be a cooperative partner with them, and it ultimately turns out that everybody has completely different goals, and that the West is completely uninterested in cooperative partnership unless the USSR does their bidding. Thus the Cold War.
Yes, indeed. Well,
whereas the USSR, Stalin clearly believed that if he saved the world, the West would give him credence and listen to him because they would be grateful. And that turned out not to be the case at all. The West was never grateful to Stalin in any way.
No, they weren't. And that's actually a harsh lesson that a lot of people have to learn, is never ever trust Western imperialists. But Chris, let me ask you this question. Changing subject, which is actually, tell us a bit about your background and how you ended up doing, indie left journalism and doing the kind of work you do. I'm very curious your response to that.
Well, I mean, my background is, my parents were a teacher and a social worker.
Oh, really?
Okay. I ended up not having the patience or ability to brown nose and play politics to finish my formal education, and therefore not having a university degree of any sort. I ended up working various blue collar and working class white collar jobs instead of the academia or journalism or political career that had initially interested me before I really learned that you have to play politics and brown nose to advance through school and your professional career in just the right way for any of that stuff to be available to you. And I've always been too honest to brown nose and play politics, and too egotistical to
engage in any form of self-censorship or
to not want to tell the truth about problems and make suggestions about how things could be better.
Interesting.
I mean, I finally found a career in technical support where the job is, saying something about problems and making suggestions about how things might be better.
But for some reason, so you're because that is your day job. That's your day job. But when it comes to like, and this kind of goes back to that first official question of mine. And so do you find like easier to do that than actually than to organize with supposedly like-minded folks, the left and so forth, and when you make some suggestions, maybe we should, target, no, not target, maybe we should look at this overlooked, marginalized group and organize with them and listen to their grievances and try to build a popular
well, I mean, my argument is always, my show has always been open to anyone looking to build a movement and talk to people about what they're talking about and what's important to them, in the interest of exposing people to everything and people joining whatever is going to most help them, but also to sort of build this community of people who are aware of each other as well as doing their own thing, and hopefully add more coherence to all this. I'm trying to do in my own way what Students for a Democratic Society was doing. I'm trying to give people tools and say, okay, now use this in your social and political life as you think it benefits you. Join organizations that you believe in and try to build some wider movement through those organizations.
Then, actually, before I get to this, to a topic that you often address on your show, which is disability rights, I didn't have to ask, going back to the first question of how you got to start doing Eclectic Radical. Tell us a bit more about your left evolution and what motivates you to start Eclectic Radical.
Well, I've always been interested in socialism and anarchism and communism as sort of an intellectual and academic way, but I sort of had this sort of stuck up idea in my head that, as a lot of people do, that yeah, but that doesn't really work. This is America. Here's how things are. So all I can really do is be a liberal and hope to sort of spread some of these ideas within the liberal community. And that's not how it works. And participating in, democratic politics ultimately sort of drives you towards democratic politics at the expense of other things. However, that said, in 2018, end of 2018, I joined Twitter because the therapist I was seeing at the time said I needed an intellectual outlet. So I joined Twitter, say, okay, let's see what's going on in social media and what sort of conversations are being had, and maybe I'll find something. And I did. I became very involved from 2018 to 2020 in sort of the online expression of the Bernie Sanders movement, which was definitely to the left of politics that I had flirted with participating in before, and which was also definitely more in tune with some of with not waiting for some of the more basic ideas that had already taken hold in Europe. And I was still not as radicalized as I am today. There were still things that were intellectual or academic to me and not social. But it was around that time in the Bernie Sanders movement that I started really getting involved in online organizing and online political communications and sharing and informing people about what was going on out there in the wider political world, not just that, oh yeah, everybody's excited about AOC, but all these people nobody had heard of running all over the country on the same principles in 2020 that AOC claimed to believe in 2018. And I ended up being very, very disillusioned by things that happened after 2020 and 2021 and going forward, as movements broke apart over thinking it was more important to support Democrats than to work for the things that supposedly were the only reason it was worth supporting Democrats.
Interesting.
And so it's just, I don't feel, and I had a lot of falling outs with a lot of people I had met in independent media who were Bernie people at the time. I had become a co-host on a now defunct podcast called Niall Elkim versus the World on Friday nights. As near as I can tell, the host doesn't have any YouTube or social media presence anymore that I've been able to find. He seems to have disappeared since then, whereas I'm still at it. But we had broken up at the time because I was no longer content to support Democrats, and he didn't want to. He became strongly opposed to criticism of AOC because she's what we have in Congress. We need to protect her. But that meant protecting her from criticism on the left more rather than protecting her from criticism on the right.
Interesting.
And people started defending AOC for not doing the things she promised them to do, as opposed to, pressuring her to keep her promises. And like, well, why you need to pressure Republicans? Well, Republicans didn't make these promises. Democrats did. AOC did. If they can't support their own promises, then what? But no, lots of people didn't want to buck the wagon or oppose Democrats back then. And we got 4 years of Biden that practically guaranteed 4 years of Trump. Along the way, I broke up with another host. I'm still not 100% sure why. There were things that happened at the time that I didn't understand and that I still don't understand. But I ended up falling out with another co-host and having to go it on my own again. And that's what I've been doing since, trying to go it on my own.
Yeah, well, and I wasn't going to ask this question, but I feel the need to ask this because it's almost a perfect segue to when we talk about disability rights and so forth like that. Is so because clearly, when I watch your program sometimes, when you would invite me on your show, so it was very clear that that you are very much a socialist, and I wouldn't call you like a committed diehard Sandinista, but like me, you would definitely like to see some of those Bernie Sanders policies advance and so forth. But you're also an you're also an anti-imperialist and whatnot. So you're all and you are and you do believe strongly in in very noble causes like disability rights and so forth. So why is it that some on quote unquote the left, these are kind of like so there are two things that kind of happened, going back to what you were talking about. There are some on the kind of YouTube left, let's just call it that, and I don't even mean that as an insult, but
that includes me. I mean, that's the trouble, is criticism of the YouTube left always comes back to the fact that I'm on YouTube too.
Yeah. And I don't even mean that as an insult, but there are these people with big platforms, these are Majority Reports, Humanist Reports, the kind and so forth, in which
these are the people I fell out with.
They're supposed to be like this alternative left space, but like Nation magazine, they always go back to saying you guys support Democrats, and then you have these other.
These are the people I fell out with in 2021. Literally, Humanist Report and I were mutuals on Twitter in 2020, and that stopped in 2021. So yeah, no, you can't, if you want, the only criticism I can make of anybody in that group anymore is just that they are not interested in breaking away from conventional liberalism or the Democratic Party in the end. They have lots of great ideals, but they are not willing to do things they perceive for whatever reason as risky, because they seem to think there's something that can be lost that people have that they're not already in danger of losing.
Yeah.
And I don't completely understand the conservatism, and by conservatism I mean in the most literal sense, averse to risk, the conservatism of the American left in every way that really matters.
But that's not just even a U.S. problem. This is a problem in Canada. This is a problem in England, which is a country I've been to many times, and I've met people who you would call radical leftists. They would call themselves Trotskyists. They would call themselves Marxists, Leninists, communists, whatever you want to say it. And yet, every time, like I follow British politics, or I go visit my friends who are involved in noble, peaceful, people power movements, it all goes back to why doesn't the left advance? Because they're so committed, they're addicted to this abusive relationship with the Labor Party. And literally, all the things that radical leftists complain about, the left, unions, whatever you want to call it, big organizations which only address whatever, the plight of black people, the plight of queer people, or the plight of, immigrants, undocumented or otherwise, all go back to the Democratic Party. And you literally can say the exact same thing in Australia, in New Zealand, in Germany with SPD, and France. So it really is not just like a U.S. problem.
If you think about it, if you really look at Canadian history, Tommy Douglas was more successful as an independent candidate with an independent working class political organization in alignment with him than the entire National Democratic Party has been ever since he founded it.
Yeah.
And you look at that. Once you start, it's this, I really hate to say it because it's true. When you start to join the institutions of the ruling class, you start to assume a ruling class perspective about things. As soon as he went from being an independent candidate to a party leader with a caucus that he had to be responsible for, Tommy Douglas became less effective. Because what happens in parliamentary caucuses is very different from what happens in independent political movements.
Interesting. But how do you explain? Okay, so there's that part of.
It's worth noting that the Bolsheviks, prior to the revolution in which they then controlled the only caucus, the Bolsheviks never joined any caucuses in the Russian parliament during the period of liberal democracy. They were always independent. They always stuck to their line. They always repeated the same demands on behalf of the people that they intended to represent. There are all sorts of criticisms that you can level against the Bolsheviks at various times in history. But you have to admire them for maintaining their independent political organization. They only actually lose their independent political organization when the person of general secretary of the party and the person of political leader of the movement are united in one person in Stalin. Because prior to that, Stalin handled bureaucracy, so Lenin and Trotsky didn't have to. And so you had the leaders freed from bureaucracy in a way that has not happened anywhere else in the world. Even maybe communist Cuba, but not even communist China or communist North Korea, I would say.
But then in the U.S. and even in similar countries, like, okay, so there's those who position themselves as being more to the left than Obama, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, and so forth like that. And then they will prop up, somebody like a Bernie Sanders, AOC, or Mamdani. But then you had this brief moment where you had many kind of like YouTube leftists who were on the Bernie Sanders bandwagon, got disillusioned when Bernie kept propping up. When Bernie
Jimmy Dore,
yes, yeah,
who's now completely indistinguishable from any other right-wing crank out there.
Yeah, so how do you explain that? This used to be my 2 cents about it. Was that Jimmy Dore or similar folks like Jimmy Dore basically got disillusioned with the with Bernie Sanders, got very disillusioned at third party politics for whatever is the reason, and then because there's always been this sort of since Alexander Coburn, there's always been elements of the left that believes in this kind of left-right alliance, that if you agree with a libertarian on this anti-war position, on stopping the drug war here, we can work with them on that. Maybe we will be able to convert them into socialism and so forth. So you have the kind of like Jimmy Dores and and outlets like the Gray Zone and so forth, and then that movement, those elements of the anti-imperialist movement, when it came to
because you mentioned the Gray Zone,
COVID and stuff like that.
Because you mentioned the Gray Zone, I am going to go ahead and call Max and Anya out. You learn about the class outlook of an organization by how its leaders treat their employees and ex-employees. When Ben, I'm blanking on his last name right now. What was that?
Ben Norton.
Yes, Ben Norton. When Ben Norton left the Gray Zone to do work for other groups, he started doing much better work, being separate from the Gray Zone. And after a couple of years, Anya felt it necessary to say that, Ben Norton was never a partner or an equal or a friend of her and Max. He was always just an employee. In very classist language, this is some bum who works for me or who worked for me. And so if you see yourself as the boss in your putatively anti-capitalist political organization, are you really opposed to bosses? Are you really on the side of workers in other situations? It's the same question we ask about Cenk Uygur over at Young Turks when he really, really tried hard to stop the formation of a union when it first tried to form itself at his political organization.
Yes, and a mutual comrade of ours, a mutual comrade of ours. Oh my gosh, why am I blanking on his name? Connor
Epsom.
So stupid, I almost blanked on his name. But yes, mutual comrade of ours, Connor, did a brilliant article actually about the dark side of the non-profit indie left world, particularly talking about TYT. But he also did some great expose in that article about Jacobin Magazine and Current,
yes,
so forth. Bless you.
And of course, excuse me, sorry. One of the downsides of having tiny sinuses. And one of the benefits of having tiny sinuses is I rarely get a cold or a flu, and I think I've still managed to avoid COVID, maybe not. But the downside of tiny sinuses is I have so many of the same symptoms that I would have if I did have a cold or the flu all the time, that is it really worth not catching them? To which I still have to tell myself, of course it is. It's always good not to be sick.
But the long story short, going back to how you started doing, eclectic radical and stuff like that. So you had that half of leftists that you were organizing with, and people who were also having their own indie left outlets, who later just became, okay, we're not going to criticize anything.
People were choosing sides in 2021 between the Young Turks and Jimmy Dore, for lack of a better way to describe it.
Yes, that happened.
And I was uninterested in choosing either side because I didn't see a functional difference in the way Jimmy Dore and Cenk Uygur ran their business, or in the journalistic ethics of TYT and the Jimmy Dore Show. No matter how much they personally expressed dislike for each other, there was always this sort of kayfabe element, maybe not in that they really didn't dislike each other, but that they really didn't disagree on as much as they claimed to, that all of their problems came back to ways in which they were actually very much alike.
Interesting.
And so I was just uninterested in taking either side. These are opportunists who are out for themselves, who are clearly exploiting the other independent media figures gravitating around them in a very selfish and exploitative way, not working cooperatively with people, not asking them what they want to talk about or bringing people on shows to voice their issues, but to bring people on shows in ways that uphold their worldview. I'm not going to say I don't have my own worldview. I do, and I admit that I try to uphold my worldview to a great degree. But if I have someone on my show, I think their worldview is compatible with mine in the first place. I don't feel like I need to manipulate their worldview in any way in order to reinforce mine. I feel like they should talk about what they want to talk about. I'm going to respond the way I feel like responding, and we'll have a good conversation / argument / debate where in the end we both learn something. But, not everybody wants to do that. Some people just want to keep articulating a very specific propaganda line to support someone else who may not be supporting them in return in the end. I mean, you don't get continued benefits from being affiliated with TYT or Jimmy Dore if you disagree with them. That's when those benefits stop.
Yes.
And I'm always going to disagree with someone in the end, so why does it make any sense to affiliate myself with them in a way that limits my ability to disagree with them later?
Fascinating. And then, well, that's a perfect segue to this question, which is talk about how did you become involved as well as a big advocacy for disability rights and the fight against ableism? And my follow-up question to that is the fight for mental health care being part of a new or existing single-payer system anywhere in the world and fighting against the stigma of mental health sufferers linked to the rights of disabled people? I'm very curious your response.
We need a holistic and socialist way of looking at healthcare that includes both physical and mental health. We need to not stigmatize various physical or mental health issues in ways that can only be called eugenic. We need to include disabled people in the better world that we want to build rather than leave them out, and to find ways in which, and this goes for more than just disabled people, but disability rights really makes this important in a way that nothing else does. One of the freedoms articulated in the American Declaration of Independence, which is misunderstood and misinterpreted and misspoken repeatedly, is the pursuit of happiness. Because we see the pursuit of happiness in terms of 20th and 21st century English, and not in the terms of 17th and 18th century English. Now, in 18th century English, when Thomas Jefferson writes, ironically, considering he owned slaves, but when Thomas Jefferson writes The Pursuit of Happiness, what he is saying is that pursuit, you have to understand, pursuit in that time meant what you do, your job or your career or your livelihood. Use now. Jefferson would have told people that his pursuit was that he was a farmer and gentleman and country squire who dabbled in politics and academia because that's what gentlemen did. And so it's important to understand what pursuit means in the context of the Declaration of Independence. He is saying people should be able to make a living in a way that makes them happy. Now, in a sense, this is the ultimate expression of socialism in the worker boss. Every worker has the right to be happy at work.
Yeah.
Whatever they decide to do, they have the right to be happy at work.
But when it comes to disability rights and whatnot, how you got involved.
Well, disability rights is the same thing. Disability rights all come down to making social life, including work, accessible in literally in the sense of access, being able to participate for disabled people. We are denying disabled people their pursuit of happiness by putting bars in front of their participation in public life, whether it be work, community, society, politics, whatever. We deliberately put bars in front of disabled people that make this harder for them. We don't have to. We choose to. We choose to because we want to help disabled people experience a certain kind of adversity that will make them saintly in a way that will cause their disability to be inspiring to people who aren't disabled. And that's a lot of shit to dump on disabled people. We have this same idea about people who aren't disabled. We need to put this suffering on their backs to make them saintly so that they can justify their participation in society. And it's unfair regardless of who you're doing it to. But when you do it to disabled people, you are being downright cruel.
And it should become involved in addressing this topic more because of the pandemic and a lot and a lot of leftists who, in the name of fighting, they would claim in the name of fighting big pharma and the name of fighting against eugenics that they were protecting patients' rights and so forth.
But who was
by being against this?
Who was the leader
from the big pharma?
Who is the leader of this health care freedom movement that they claim to support, and what is he doing now?
RFK Jr. Take it away, my friends.
Working for Donald Trump. Helping Donald Trump to enact his agenda, which does nothing like make America healthy again. We have a man running the United States Department of Health and Human Services who believes that disabled people should be made to work harder in order to be healthier and less disabled. And that's not how it works. You're never going to be able to make someone who uses a wheelchair rise from their wheelchair by making them work harder. You might damage their underlying health and kill them sooner.
They can contribute in more than many ways, but not get up out of your chair and just believe that you can walk kind of nonsense.
But then you have to remember that part of this Republican political movement are a group of religious cultists who believe that faith healed Evander Holyfield's heart defect. No, he had heart surgery at some point and didn't tell anyone, and used the whole faith healer story to cover up the fact that he at some point he had to have elective heart surgery so that people didn't know that he, a boxer, had heart surgery, because then it would be easier for him to get licensed.
Interesting.
But he went through this big story of going to a faith healer named Benny Hinn, who operates his own tele-evangelical megachurch, and being healed to cover up the fact that he had had surgery to improve his circulation so that his heart would no longer be enlarged.
And to that time, that's fascinating in of itself. And but did that time in the pandemic when a lot of leftists reveal themselves to be, basically, libertarians, did were you did you just see like a lot of people in the community, those who were already disabled and so forth, get fate, were you exposed to just how cruel the welfare system is and so forth when
it's not even that. It's during this period where people were falling out with one another. You see how the Jimmy Dores of the world are completely willing to throw disabled people under the bus, and working people under the bus, and children who are being forced back into school in unhealthy and unsafe conditions under the bus. And I mean, it's like, okay, you got to be on the side of the people being thrown under the bus in this situation, not the side of the people doing the throwing. We've talked about that before.
Yeah. And so that and so that's how you and with that that's how that's one of the reasons why you've used your platform to talk to people who are disabled and whatnot, and shine a light.
If you want to accuse me of any one thing that stems from my whatever problems I have as a white man, it's probably the fact that I feel some sort of need to be a white savior, which drives me to always side with whoever I perceive to be the underdog.
I would call that a good white leftist, not a white savior, but.
But I mean, if you're trying to put racially based criticism on me, I mean, there's the thing is that I have what people might call a savior complex.
No. I'm just asking, like, how did you come to become a champion of this, more or less?
Well, I mean, it's just I saw people be mean to people after they got sick, or I saw people not be able to participate the same way they participated before because they were sick. And I saw how people who were supposed to be their friends and colleagues, even as they continued to be their friends and colleagues, never talked about the issues that made their friend and colleague sick. I have a great deal of regard for both Katie Halper and Brianna Joy Gray, but have they ever talked about long COVID or COVID in the way that Leslie Lee III did before he passed? And they're his friends and colleagues. Why did they not care about his issues while he was sick and passing on? And this is why I fall out with people, I suppose, because I'm willing to make these kinds of criticisms of people who probably wouldn't appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. And but that's a perfect segue to this question. I'm probably going to lose some friends over this, but we'll see. You've interviewed on your program, changing subjects. You've interviewed on your program sex positive feminists and I believe sex workers several times on your show. Now, for the record, I am agnostic on the topic. I see really good arguments both for and against legalized sex work, but do explain why leftists, social justice warriors, feminists, and abolitionists should challenge their socially conservative blind spots and be behind the legalization and complete decriminalization of sex work. And I just want to say also for the record that the more research I've actually been doing on abolitionism and so forth, the more I find myself, however reluctant, more leaning towards legalizing and completely decriminalizing sex work. So I just want to make that clear. But Chris, do respond to that question.
I mean, sex workers are some of the most exploited workers on the planet. We claim to be socialists. These are the people we should be trying to find solidarity with. Is there a more vulnerable worker than a sex worker? Is there a more exploited worker than a sex worker? I mean, maybe, maybe not. But I mean, this is where we also have to think about our Puritanism and sort of step aside from Christian or even Abrahamic in general sometimes attitudes towards sex and human bodies, and instead try to adopt a Renaissance humanist approach towards sex and human bodies, if such a thing is possible, and sort of say that, you know, we have to take a limited, religiously driven moral framework out of the question. We have to see this in the pure terms of the fact that, one, human activity is work. That work includes all human activity and not just what we think of as work. That what we think of as work falls into the specific category of productive work. But there is also an important category of reproductive work, the purpose of which is to make us able and give us the infrastructure to both continue our work in a personal sense and make sure that larger work can be done in the future by having children or what have you not. And that this reproductive work, and I believe Engels wrote a book about this, if you want to be really technical, this reproductive work has been passed off onto women and labeled women's work and left unpaid. And that a great portion of this reproductive work is taken on by sex workers who are then marginalized by this work they are taking on. If you do not, it is very difficult. It is very difficult to separate sex from other kinds of human activity if you completely remove Puritanism from your mindset. And it is very difficult to relegate sex to the same pile as all other human activity if you can't take Puritanism out of your mindset. The idea that we have all other human activity here and sex here in its own box comes directly from Puritanism.
Interesting.
Now, whether we approve of all the places that it took them or not, it should be noted that the classical world had very different mores about sex than Puritans do. We can choose to dislike those mores, and we can absolutely reject the abuse-related mores of classical sexuality the same way we can reject the abuse-related mores of Puritan sexuality. But we can also understand that the existence of classical sexuality with its different abusive relations and its effort to disentangle the abusive relations from the sexual relations, at least in theory, if not always in practice, shows that there are alternatives to the Puritan way of thinking about sex. And that we don't necessarily have to adopt a classically libertine attitude about sex to, at the same time, start talking about sex in a way that makes it part of human activity and not some special taboo the way Puritans do.
Interesting.
We need to look at sex as part of all the other human activities where, whether we like it or not, what we consider a free society is always going to involve other people making choices we don't like when it comes to the way they personally live their lives. This is one of the biggest things that socialists and even anarchists wrestle with, the idea that somehow we have to stop playing cop in our daily existence. Now, in America, especially among white Americans, this comes from the fact that all of white society was supposed to act as de facto police when it involved black people breaking the law.
You know, actually, if you have anything more you want to add, please go. But yeah.
Well, I mean, so much of middle class petty bourgeois morality and the caring about what other people are doing is just the extension of this social cop morality as practiced against black people to other poor and working class people.
Yeah, cop in the heart, right? I believe that's what LGBT
yes
means.
Kill the cop in your mind, as the new leftist said in the late 60s, early 70s.
But that being said, that's actually a perfect segue. We actually are going to be, and I think we might even be returning to the topic of legalizing prostitution.
Decriminalization, not legalization, as my sex worker friends would want me to say.
Wait, say that again?
Decriminalization, not legalization.
Okay. So we'll definitely be returning back to that, because I do have a couple of questions that is related to sex work and so forth. So, but changing gears a little bit, you are one of the few white leftists I've come across who is for abolishing the police. Explain briefly why, and do you think community control of the police is the best way to get there?
Well, I mean, what good are the police doing in the United States? I'm not even going to go into Europe or Canada or Australia, though you can make the same argument there that you can in the US from slightly different perspectives.
Yeah.
But ultimately, whether it grows out of slavery in the US and Latin America, or whether it grows out of controlling undesirable populations that must be forced to work more than others, as in the UK, Australia, and Canada, there is an element of anti-worker culture in which the cops always existed specifically to discipline specific segments of the workforce. In the US, to the point where every white person was expected to act as a cop when it came to black people breaking the rules. You can see the same thing in the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, where every Irish Protestant was expected to act as a cop against Irish Catholics, regardless of whether they were Irish or English in their origins. And Catholics were disenfranchised regardless of whether they were Irish or English in their origins. Many Irish Catholics are descended from people now who were once referred to as the Old English, who were the descendants of Norman settlers in Ireland under Henry II, who were called, by the time Cromwell got there, and this is the origin of the phrase, more Irish than the Irish. Because they had so thoroughly, being Catholics themselves, they had perfectly adopted into the local Irish socio-political religious culture. They fit right into this clan-based and religious agreement-based, universally religious, that's the best way to put it, this religiously universal system, in a way that made perfect sense to them and pissed off the other English who were Protestants now, especially the Puritans.
But so do you think that that the best way to get to a world of abolishing the police is community control over the police, or?
I think that ultimately the way of abolishing the police is to cut off all the money the police get until no one wants to be a cop, and then just not hire any more cops.
Jeez, that's
Let them all quit.
That's
Let the police wither away.
that's radical defunding if I ever heard it.
But jokes aside, I mean, defund the cops. Right now, the cops have so much non-state funding that when I say defund the cops, I mean take away all the money that they're raising for themselves through police beneficial associations, sergeants beneficial associations, police unions. None of these organizations actually advocate for cops as workers. They're ways for the cops to absorb money that then gets funneled into both police departments and the pockets of individual cops.
But I wonder, because you kind of already,
but that's the first step. No American politicians ever addressed this part of defunding the police. But that first step is to criminalize all those independent organizations raising money for the cops. Criminalize the police receiving funds anywhere but from their municipal, state, or federal government.
Interesting. But then I wonder, it's a great segue to this question, and then I wonder, what's your response to the often easy, cheap counter argument that the police are a necessary evil because of serial killers, pedophiles, serial rapists, and how do you overcome that argument? How do you overcome that argument, assuming that you are having a mature conversation to be had?
Anyone who has ever watched the genre of American true crime and removed their capitalist and pro-cop goggles that sort of blind them to what's going on can see that every famous criminal case has one of two or three patterns, and that certain parts of these patterns are always the same across all three. It always starts in the same place. Detectives investigating crime specifically decide they don't like someone in the group of witnesses they initially spoke to, and because they don't like that person, they decide he must be the killer.
Wait. Repeat that again. Repeat that again, because that's very important.
So the detectives whose job it is to talk to witnesses and determine the basic facts of the life of the person who was the victim of the crime, generally decide during this process that they dislike one of the potential witnesses more than others, and that person must be the killer, because otherwise they wouldn't dislike them so much.
Okay, yeah, I get you. Okay, yeah, continue.
And so the first thing that happens with every famous criminal case is that the cops waste a massive amount of time investigating an innocent person because they don't like them. So that's the first, and that's common to all three patterns. The second step, also common to all three patterns, is at some point it becomes completely unavoidable for the police not to recognize that they don't have any evidence to bust this person that they are sure is guilty, but who is actually totally innocent. And so they stop actively investigating him, but sort of quietly surveil and watch and interfere in his life, hoping that he'll do something stupid and allow them to arrest him and try to get on him again for the murder. If he has any criminal background, they look into his past criminal record in ways that are designed to make it say he's a violent person who must have committed the murder. But at some point, eventually, in the end, they have to stop. They either arrest the wrong person, which ends that pattern right there, because they arrest the wrong person and now he's in prison, and the guilty person is still out there. But that pattern aside, then the second point is, okay, we can't arrest this person. We haven't been able to. Maybe they really didn't do it. All right, let's open a tip line and ask the public for tips. And so at that point, the public starts giving them tips. And they start investigating every tip the public gives them, whether it has any bearing on the case or not, especially if it all involves the person they thought was guilty in the first place who turned out not to be.
Okay.
So after the public tip line is now exhausted the first time, they basically give up and stop working on it. It becomes a cold case. Now, this is where there are two other patterns that can happen at this point. And it depends, and they only happen in cases where somebody still cares. So option number one is now the family with no other options left, if they have the money, they hire a lawyer or a private investigator to look into the case independently. If they hire a lawyer, then of course their lawyer hires private investigators to look into the case. And somebody finds some actual useful lead, which they then try to convince the cops to pursue. And generally at this point, the cops resist reopening the case and pursuing this useful lead. And they're only finally forced to do so by the continued pressure of the victim's family. So if your family doesn't have money or clout, nobody's going to care about your murder. Good likelihood. Certainly not the cops. This case is cold to them. They stopped investigating it. So then you have the third pattern, which is less common than the other pattern because people are still more likely to have families with money than for some journalists to care about them, especially since they're firing journalists all over America right now anyway. But the second pattern is some reporter just won't let go of the case and keeps looking into it and eventually comes up with a lead. And then it's all about the media trying to get the police to reopen this case, which the police resist because, oh, this is the media. The media don't know anything. Why should we listen to them? But eventually, if somebody cares enough, the police reopen the case and arrest the right person.
But that's
But keep in mind,
yeah,
these are the cases that the cops consider successes. So the cases the cops consider successes are successes in spite of the cops. Not even the cops are the passive beneficiary of help from outsiders, but that outsiders do more work to solve the case than the cops. And everything the cops do is motivated by either their personal grievances or outside pressure. So if everything the cops do is motivated either by their personal grievances or outside pressure, what good are they? Yes. They're not fulfilling their role in society. Why do we have them? And to which all people can say, well, it's better than nothing. Prove it. Prove it's better than nothing. Because if we had nothing, we wouldn't have cops killing people.
But that's a perfect...
Obviously, getting rid of the cops won't solve serial killers or solve private murders, but it will solve the problem of cops killing people. If we get rid of the cops, cops won't kill people anymore. And that will decrease the total number of murders.
But...
tell me I'm wrong. Convince me I'm logically incorrect.
Well, that's a perfect... Well, to kind of vindicate your argument, that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, let's talk about Copaganda. something we've done on your program many times.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, let's talk about Copaganda, and can you talk about how even a reality, yeah, I guess you could call it a reality show, how a reality show like America's Most Wanted and its longtime host, Joe Walsh, played a huge
John Walsh.
role in the unnecessary and cruel mass incarceration and neo-Keynesian injustice system to the U.S., correct?
You know, it's interesting that you mention America's Most Wanted, because the context of John Walsh's personal history is very interesting.
And it's a sad one.
It is. Well, no. But, you know, his son was murdered, and that is sad. But what's interesting about it is that his son's murder became involved in one of the biggest police scandals ever. His son's murder became central to one of the biggest police scandals ever, which is that two drifters in Texas. Let me look up the other guy's name. I always remember the one because he's the one who was finally so allegedly proved to have killed John Walsh's son.
Yeah.
Yes, there it is. Okay, so there were two drifters in Texas. There we go. Two drifters in Texas. Otis Toole, not Otis, Otis, two T's. Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas. Both of these men were white men of bourgeois / petty bourgeois family backgrounds who chose to live a certain kind of bohemian lifestyle that their families always seem to think proves some people choose to be homeless, which isn't the same thing at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so they chose to live a certain sort of drifter lifestyle that is not the same as truly being homeless. And in the course of living this drifter lifestyle, they became sucked into various criminal activities and definitely did kill Henry Lee Lucas's mother. And Otis Toole may or may not have really been a serial killer who was really sort of manipulating Henry Lee Lucas the whole time or not, but they got arrested by cops in Texas who proved that they killed Henry Lee Lucas's mother. But then instead of trying them and convicting them for that crime, they kept them in legal limbo, feeding them cases because they kept confessing to all these other murders around the state of Texas that was allowing this one department in Texas that wasn't particularly important to build this massive, super important serial killer case. And so ultimately there was this trial in which Henry Lee Lucas was accused of killing as many as 100 people that ultimately fell apart because they couldn't convict him on any murder but his mom's. And as a result, we don't even know if Otis Toole really killed John Walsh's son, because even though the murder was hung on Otis Toole, other murders that were hung on Otis Toole and or Henry Lee Lucas were ultimately committed by other people who were caught, thereby debunking the case against Henry Lee Lucas in the first place. Therefore, we only have the findings of a flawed judicial system, which was manipulating both Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas to build this huge serial killer case that would make them look great. They couldn't convict Otis Toole on a whole bunch of charges either. They were able to convict him on John Walsh's son and one or two other murders, but it's how much of that was normal police convicting someone they wanted to convict, and how much of that was, yes, he really did it.
And yet, John Walsh, sorry. John Walsh, big law and justice, flood more money to the police.
but
harsh.
Well, he chose to believe. He chose to believe that Ottis Toole was guilty of murdering his son, and because he believed that, he was also involved in this sort of no, Henry Lee Lucas is guilty movement. When, again, the cops were pinning most of these murders on Henry Lee Lucas. He only actually killed his mom.
But that's...
Remember, the cops tried to pin all the murders they ultimately did pin on Ottis Toole on Henry Lee Lucas first, and had problems with all proving any of the crimes that Ottis Toole actually confessed to himself. He wasn't convicted of any of the things he confessed to, except for the murder of Henry Lee Lucas's mother, the same way Henry Lee Lucas was convicted for that. But the murders that Ottis Toole was convicted of were murders that Henry Lee Lucas had confessed to first, and they were not able to prove any of the cases that Ottis Toole confessed to. But in the end, they got Ottis Toole on these three murders that Henry Lee Lucas had confessed to first, because Ottis Toole finally confessed to them. But he had previously been innocent of crimes he had confessed to.
But are you surprised that I mean, because clearly somebody like,
but I mean, like whatever even if he's guilty, even if Ottis Toole really committed those three murders, are you really satisfied with a police department that can only get a guy who's guilty on a confession when they've already made him confess to crimes we know he didn't commit?
Well, but that's the question I was going to ask you. You not surprised that are you not surprised that somebody like a John Walsh, who gets exposed to just how criminally incompetent the police are, and instead of, okay, he doesn't have to become an abolitionist. I wish he would, but but instead his response is, more money to the police. Let's flood more money to the police.
Let's remove the term incompetence from it, because the cops were very competent in building this case against Henry Lee Lucas and Ottis Toole that the state of Texas and the federal government both became very interested in, very willing to believe that these were real serial killers who must be punished for these hundreds and hundreds of murders. But in the end, they convicted Henry Lucas of one murder, his mother, and Ottis Toole of 4 murders, Henry Lucas's mother and these other 3 people, one of which was John Walsh's son. And this is out of hundreds and hundreds of accusations. This is not incompetence. This is... The cops were criminally competent at hanging hundreds of murders on 2 people who at most committed 4 between them.
But then that being said, but that being said, and we'll return to John Walsh and his horrible contributions in enlarging the cruel neo-Dickensian system that is the police. But then, are you surprised that the strongest argument?
I reject the term. I reject the term neo-Dickensian. The London police, who are the ancestors of all the other police, did come into being during the Dickensian period. I insist all police are Dickensian. No neo about it.
No problem. No problem.
It's like neo-Nazi. The real neo-Nazis are the original Nazis, as they were just copying Americans.
Exactly. Although exactly. Are you okay? So that being said, are you surprised that the strongest argument for the police is the whole serial killer argument? But there have been countless scandals of serial killers targeting sex workers, and the police just repeatedly fail spectacularly to apprehend the mass murderer. And this
beyond
wait. And
beyond that failure.
And this is in the age of DNA and so much spent on the police, and we still see countless scandals where one has to move, as you've mentioned, heaven and earth to get the police to do their job in apprehending a serial killer because the victims often were prostitutes.
In California, the Golden State Killer, when he was finally apprehended, turned out to have actually been a cop for several years.
Wow.
Another serial killer, the dating game killer. The dating game killer.
Robert Alcalta, I believe that was his name.
I can never remember his name. The dating game killer is all I remember. That's how sadly this is in our culture.
The one that like Anna Kendrick did like a movie of on Netflix.
Well, there was one where he was eventually exposed by his. He eventually exposed because his daughter wrote a book about everything he did, and people had still not connected some of his crimes. But he lived a perfectly normal life, was a contestant on the dating game, and actually worked as a consultant for the police on how criminals think because he had served time in prison, and the whole time he was a serial killer.
Wow, they never mentioned that part in the story.
But yeah, he was working as a consultant for the LAPD, the very people who were investigating the dating game killer murders, because he was a reformed ex-convict who had also taken police psychology courses and was qualified to tell them how crooks thought.
Wow. But that's just crazy because we're told we need
a professional criminal manipulated the cops into letting him get away with being a serial killer by squealing on other criminals.
But it still is so scandalous because the whole Copaganda, the police are a necessary evil, blah, blah, blah. So what if they murdered unarmed, racialized people? We still need the police to capture the serial killers and pedophiles and so forth. But again, look, like Jack the Ripper, who was never caught, targeted serial killers and so forth. And the response is, well, we need more studying. We need more science. We need more money so that we can do all these DNA testings. And still in this age of DNA testing and whatnot, the police, it took them years to capture Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire killer. Had to move heaven and earth to do that because the
Yorkshire Ripper, yes. Because the Yorkshire Ripper.
They had to move heaven and earth to get the police to do that because the police just did not give a shit about sex workers and all the things that you talked about, the patterns of how the police catches serial killers. That's that one in a nutshell. And then And then do we even have to talk about Robert Pickton and other mass serial killers in Canada who've targeted sex workers, not just Indigenous, but yeah, well, I mean.
Ed Kemper, the smiley face killer. He targeted vulnerable women, some of whom were sex workers, some of whom were just hitchhikers. He targeted women at truck stops who no one was going to miss. And the cops never really cared. The only reason the cops cared enough to catch him in the end was because he enjoyed getting away with it so much that he started taunting the police. He actually got away with his first murder because they convicted the wrong people for it, because they confessed. Here's that story again. The wrong people somehow confessed to a murder, and the cops are content to leave it that way. And then once again, the real killer ultimately, when he was finally caught because he kept taunting the police, confessed to everything. And so once again, the cops who let him get away because they believed the wrong people's confession only got the actually guilty person because he confessed. But they're the people who hung the confession on innocent people, so how do we know they didn't hang the confession on this guy? So it's just scary when you think about it, because, I mean, Ed Kemper probably really is a serial killer. If he's pretending for attention, he plays the part really well. But we can't be completely convinced of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt for the simple reason that the same cops who took his confession were completely willing to be convinced by the confession that they had forced people to give them.
Well, and what I continue to find quite scandalous is when we talk about Copaganda and whatnot. We're always there's Jack the Ripper, or there's the criminals that they did catch. It could be a Jeffrey Dahmer, it could be a Robert Pickton, John Wayne Gacy, who targeted men of all age. There's other scandals.
Let's remember.
There's also lots of scandals of a serial killer targeting gay people that
both
just purposely.
Both John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy were able to get away with it for as long as they did because they were respectable-looking white people from good families who no one would ever suspect of everything. John Wayne Gacy had relatives who were deep in the Chicago political machine, and Ted Bundy had daughters who were had relatives, in Orange County, California, who were involved enough in the local political scene to donate lots of money to Republicans. I mean, it's just crazy.
It is amazing. It is scary. Because first,
the serial killers come from the ruling class. And how often do the cops go after the ruling class?
Good points.
And with that in mind, what good are police will always be the least effective way to catch serial killers, because so many serial killers are members of the ruling class.
Well, Robert Pickton was known to have parties on his farms, and lots of police people were there. Not saying anything. Make what you will with that, though.
But we forget about this in the U.S. and Canada, because there's a thing in the U.S. Canada where we think of these family farms maintaining themselves in struggling times during the difficult years of the Depression, or of the hard and highly detrimental to the lifespan of white people project of settling the American West and displacing indigenous people.
Yeah.
We get this idea of farmers as these poor, struggling people, and not people who own lots of property and are therefore respected in their communities.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because I mean, we have this image of the poor farmer scraping by. You see it in our movies, American and Canadian. You see it in our literature. Anne of Green Gables is a great example, because Morella and Matthew are well off. They're kind of the ruling class in their community, but we're supposed to feel sympathetic for their struggles as they take in this young orphan.
But yes, and if one wants to do some deep dives into the Marc Dutroux scandal and the country I'm based in, Belgium, I'll let people do some research on that and Robert Pickton. But yeah, they're very friendly with the cops and the ruling elites. But then I have to ask this question. I have to ask this question, because I don't want to minimize how awful serial killings are when they happen. When they happen, they are horrendous. Or when a pedophile rapes its victim, or repeatedly abuses.
If you add up the numbers, you will find that the police kill more people than serial killers.
But look, it's horrible when a pedophile does their crime. It's horrible when a serial killer does no crime, and the same thing with child abduction. However, here is an even bigger scandal. As horrendous as those crimes are, and even though America has the most reported cases, we're number one in serial killers, it's important, very important, to say the following to people. And this would help the abolitionist cause. Most sociopaths, in fact, most people who have pedophilic desires, don't act on it. Most sociopaths don't become serial killers. And yet, the vast majority of people in prisons who are given the harshest, most punitive punishments, like never being allowed to vote, no right to welfare, no public housing assistance, forever have to, put when they're applying for a job that they were convicted of a crime, which makes people not want to hire you. Most people in that new Jim Crow system, that neo-Keynesian system, or just the Keynesian system, are people with nonviolent drug offenses and nonviolent drug offensive. And this goes back to, again, John Walsh of America's Most Wanted. Now, let me just cite up some stuff here. Wait, give me a second, folks. Give me a second. Okay, so wait, hold up. I had it here. I really did have it here.
This happens to me all the time.
Okay, yes. Okay, here it is. So John Walsh was central. He was a central champion of the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006, which is considered one of the toughest pieces of federal legislation in this area. The controversy surrounding the law and the child abduction crisis involves several key factors. The champion of the law, John Walsh, host of America's Most Wanted and father of murdered 6-year-old Adam Walsh, was instrumental in advocating the law on the 20th anniversary of his son. Broadening of punishment. While the law was named for a victim of a stranger abduction and murder, critics argue it cast a far wider net than its namesake. It established a 3-tier national classification system for sex offenders based on the offense committed rather than individual risk of reoffending.
Yes.
Then, of course, comes the pedophile label. The law led to the registrations of many individuals whose crimes did not involve children or the FIT's clinical definition of pedophilia, and this includes nonviolent offenses, non-contact offensive, or cases involving young adults. So there's so much more I could read here but your response to all the stuff that I just said.
I don't want to minimize anything, but I think it's important to remember that when we talk about sociopaths specifically, we're using a term that comes from mental health in a way, but that it also means something else in legal terms because of the definition of sane and insane in mental health are different from the definition of sane and insane at law. So a genuinely mentally ill sociopath is treated as sane by the law because he doesn't meet the law's definition of insanity. And a person who is sane, people who are sane, have genuinely been acquitted of murder, including a sitting U.S. congressman, for temporary insanity, because at the time they committed their crime, they were allegedly incapable of telling right from wrong.
Yeah.
So it is important to remember that the legal definition of sanity and insanity has nothing to do with actual mental health. Now, when it comes to actual mental health, the clinically insane are more likely to be abused by the legal system than because they are found legally sane in the process of standing trial. So, I mean, obviously our legal system has problems that come back to this whole abolition question, because the legal system that exists is not filling any of the needs that it's supposed to fill. It just becomes a way for society to manage who does forced labor.
Yeah.
And people tolerate it because the people doing forced label are, quote, criminals, unquote.
Yeah. And at the time when Walsh was pushing for the Adam Walsh Child Protection Safety Acts, I mean, I was doing my research, and when doing my research on Google AI, kill me later about that. He was accused of wildly exaggerating how much of a nationwide crisis the abduction and sexual assault and child abduction of
yes,
was going on. And yes, and John Walsh was wildly celebrated for his advocacy, his testimony, and public statements during the push for the law, but he faced significant criticism for promoting a narrative that did not align with official crime data.
No, there aren't lots and lots of people kidnapping and murdering children.
Yeah. So this, I mean, and it's said here that the stranger danger myth. Critics and criminologists argue that Walsh's testimony focused heavily on stereotypical kidnapping, stranger abductions, creating a moral panic in reality. The Department of Justice data, however, showed that over 260,000 child abductions reported in a given year, only 115, 0.4%, were identified as stereotypical stranger kidnappings. Inflated statistics. During the height of the missing children movement, figures of 50,000 stranger abductions per year were frequently cited. Experts pointed out these numbers were wildly inflated because they included runaways, children taken by family members in custody disputes, and this, of course, the misleading risk perception. Some scholars note that Walsh's rhetoric contributed to a nation of petrified kids and paranoid parents, distracting from the statistical reality that the greatest threat to a child typically comes from family and close social.
And let's remember too. Let's remember how many of these crimes listed on paper as child abduction are very specifically, as you mentioned, non-custodial parents taking the kid that they believe will be better off with them than the custodial parent, people who have no violent intent towards the child at all, and from whom the child is not at any significant risk of harm. I mean, one of the reasons that and I don't like to remind people of this too much because it minimizes the very real problem of missing kids who don't end up very well. Many of the kids on milk cartons were last seen with a non-custodial parent and likely grew up very happy with the parent they were living with and went on to live normal lives and may not even know they're still on milk cartons. Just something to think about. Now, I'm not saying that a non-custodial parent has never harmed their child either, and so have custodial parents. And custodial parents are far more likely to have committed crimes against their children than non-custodial parents by the numbers.
But that's crazy because because again, this is in the Google AI notes. Despite being named for a victim of a horrific stranger murder, the Adam Walsh Act applied its toughest restrictions to a massive pool of offenders, again, many whom had no history of child-related crimes or violence. The registry blows. Research indicated that the law was influenced more by pervasive fear than actual criminal data. By treating all registered individuals as high-risk predators, the act was accused of flooding registries with low-risk offenders, making it more difficult for law enforcement to track genuine threats. And then, of course. Joe Walsh's stupid joke about planning a GPS and having that explode on.
Well, he wasn't joking. He tried to claim he was joking later, but he was serious about that.
He was definitely serious. He's a very, very, very right-wing person in that respect,
But it's worth noting that this is not uncommon in the United States to put protecting children on some law that doesn't actually have anything to do with protecting children, but is about punishment or censorship. We currently have a law making its way through the U.S. system right now that will ban the internet in some sense. One that's been passed in Australia already.
You mean social media, the banning of
yes, but not just social media. So there is Al Gore's internet. I hate to give him credit, but it's true. Al Gore's internet rests on Section 230. Section 230 is the law that says if you run a website and I use your website, you, as the owner of the website, are not liable for what I, as a user of your website, say. That's me using my free speech, not you choosing to publish my speech. What's happening in Congress now is that they want to repeal Section 230, which would then make, if you run a website, you're a publisher and you're liable for everything that's said on your website, whether you said it or not. Now, you have a responsibility to control what's said on your website, and you are going to have to censor anything on your website that you aren't willing to be held responsible for in court if it comes to it. So when I say destroy the internet or ban the internet, I'm not joking very much, because literally every website would feel forced by a series of pressures to ban any content they weren't willing to fight for in court if it came down to it, which means paying lawyers. So unless it's important enough to them to be worth them paying for lawyers, they're going to have to censor it.
So might as well have no comment sections then, right?
Well, that's one thing it means. No more comment sections in actual media websites. It means YouTube is now responsible for everything somebody posts to YouTube, which means if somebody doesn't like it, they can be sued, which means now if they think they'll be sued over your content or mine, they're going to censor our content.
Oh, Lord.
In Australia, this law passed, which means YouTube is banning lots of content producers to avoid being sued for their content.
And again, this has nothing to do with even addressing kids' mental health.
This has nothing to do with actually protecting children. If they were concerned with actually protecting children, they would do something like, educating parents about existing parental controls, encouraging parents to use said parental controls instead of whining to the government for nanny state laws. People whine about the nanny state when it comes to public safety or public health or social welfare. No one whines about the nanny state when it comes to censorship and criminalization.
Exactly. And but that leads to this question. Going back to abolitionism and so forth, is given the huge scandal that most police, even on a good week, aren't finding serial killers, aren't trying to catch a sexual predator, and we know that they do next to fuck all to arrest white-collar crooks from the banksters and those involved in tax dodging. Why don't more abolitionists point this out? Because you want the movement to advance, you're going to need to convince very large, densely populated middle class and largely white middle class folks who fall for the propaganda.
I think every abolitionist points that out, but that doesn't mean white people with property are going to listen to them. I mean, ultimately, the people who support cops are the landlord and the boss. Sure, there there are working class people who might feel that cops are inevitable or necessary, but ultimately the people who support the people who are going to make the decision about whether or not to defund the police are the people who hold the levers of power. And they're far more afraid of the police than they are of us right now.
But I have to challenge that, because I think a lot of middle class, white middle class folks, and even working class folks, a lot of them do fall for the huge propaganda of the get tough on crime movement. A lot of it amplified by ridiculous Copaganda films and TV series, from Dirty Harry to CSI to Criminal Minds, and countless other cop shows and movies, and even documentaries, who all largely repeat the stupid, easy to debunk nonsense that people accused of crime have these well-paid lawyers and these defense lawyers rush shots around the prosecutor.
Here in the U.S., here in the U.S., an author named Alec I can never pronounce his name. Alec Cartensensis, I'm still getting that wrong, wrote a book called Copaganda, of all things. That's been, out there on the market for years now.
Even way before popular abolitionist voices came out.
Well, I mean, it's not older than the abolition movement, but he's one of the popular abolition voices out there. He's one of the highest profile journalists writing on this topic, or lawyers involved in this topic out there. He's making these arguments all the time. It's not that abolitionists aren't saying all this stuff. It's that abolitionists aren't being given a platform in landlord-owned media. Why? Because cops work for landlords.
Oh, but I would have to say, even in left-leaning media, though, or left-wing media.
Well, when you say left-wing media, what do you mean? Because lots of people are saying stuff on the YouTube. That's not the problem. We have lots of people upholding abolitionists on YouTube. Sure, we have some annoying, loud voices shitting on abolitionists on YouTube too, but then you got to look at it. Who are the people who are successful, and why are they successful? And would they be successful if they started shitting on cops?
Okay, because at least from my perception, having a couple of books on abolitionism and listening to the few voices who are advocates of abolitionism, the one that comes to mind is Al Jones, who's been a guest on this program. Or I know there's Andrea Ritchie, wonderful black queer leftist abolitionist. And then in Canada there's the Sandy and Norris show, and they're abolitionists. But at least, and this is just my perception. So I hope people don't bite my head off. When they do talk about the abolitionist movement, it's usually to talk about it from a racial justice angle, and not emphasizing and stressing enough that most pedophiles don't actually act on their urges. Most sociopaths don't become serial killers, and that in America itself,
the abolition movement has no interest in. The abolitionist movement is not necessarily interested in challenging majority views on issues like pedophilia. They're interested in showing how unnecessary the cops are, and that if there are any dangerous pedophiles that you have to watch out for, they're most likely to be cops or preachers or a few other things. But it's also worth knowing that while there are prisoner advocate organizations, and prisoner advocate organizations are usually abolitionist for obvious reasons, not all abolitionists are necessarily pro-prisoner in their activism. They're pro-abolition because they see the police state as a threat to the Black community, which it is. And that any other benefits from dissolving the police state are secondary from their point of view from removing the police state's threat to Black community development. Now, you can disapprove of, you can agree or disagree with that, but that is a choice because the abolition movement is one that, while many advocates might be other things, it's Black women who have always driven the abolition movement. And those Black women are primarily concerned with the risk that those cops present to their families. The abolition movement is not necessarily going to uphold the interests of people who might be threats to those families.
I think I got what you were trying to say, but I mean, like,
there are people who are pro-abolition who will still talk about shooting pedophiles in the head.
Yes.
and there's a reason for that, and it's because, generally speaking, child abuse is bad, and we are all against it. And the term pedophile is not meant to describe, by most people, to describe a mental health condition. It is meant by most people to describe men who abuse women, who abuse young women and children.
But again, you know, if you want this movement to advance, and this is a very important movement, I would like to see it.
Now, I do not believe this argument.
What?
I am someone who believes in saying everything to educate people, even if they may not like hearing it. But most political organizers of today will tell you that you want to speak to the actual concerns of your audience first before raising other issues. And it has been decided that dealing with the police state as a threat to your Black and immigrant neighbors has been seen as what people will be most receptive to. And now in this escalating time of actual police violence against immigrants and Black people from ICE, I don't think they were necessarily wrong to tie minority rights and anti-cop sentiment.
Okay.
Because we're seeing a great response to that.
Now look,
an activist in Chicago referred to the ICE operations taking place in her city as a lawless occupation. So linking hatred of cops to racial justice is clearly working on some level and shouldn't be completely rejected as not effective if we're just going by how to make things most effective. I don't pretend to know what is or isn't most effective. I will acknowledge that sometimes I argue about issues in ways that might be more ineffective to the point of view of a professional political organizer, because I'm putting the issue out there and letting people talk about it without the professional political organizer being in the room and able to shape the discussion in their direction. But at the same time, I want people to be able to think about these things in ways that will ultimately make them receptive to the professional political organizer. If they're really pushing revolution in the end.
Okay. I just think
I do want to also teach people to be critical of the organizer who is not pushing revolution in the end.
But I just think if you really want the movement to advance, you're gonna have to convince a largely white people, middle class or otherwise, certainly working class as well, that the police do not solve serial killers and pedophiles.
Oh, well, they don't.
And child abduction, and actually give them
but the reason
the hardcore numbers that most sociopaths don't engage in serial killing.
There's a reason.
Most pedophiles don't actually engage in that.
There's a reason.
And that child abduction is not the epidemic.
But they believe that by linking the argument to racial justice, they are also making the argument inherently that cops don't catch serial killers. Because remember what I said about the cops go after the wrong person. Well, you know, statistically, the wrong person is usually black. And the right person, by the same statistics, is usually white. Mm-hmm. And with this in mind, when we say cops spend their time arresting and killing black people, we are saying, without saying it, cops are too busy arresting and killing black people to be catching the white people who are the serial killers. But there's also this view that you can't be, whatever that means, anti-white. And you can't say white people are the problem and that's why cops won't ever solve it. I mean, obviously I can. Obviously you can if you want to. But the people who believe that they are organizing society for the better believe that they cannot piss off the white voting majority no matter what else they do, because they have to win that white voting majority over to vote for them. So they can't make them angry. But this leads to the throwing people under the bus argument that we're talking about.
How so?
Earlier.
How so?
Because if you're making yourself socially acceptable to white people, you're throwing your socially unacceptable elements under the bus.
Yeah, I get it.
And a lot of things will never come up because bringing them up would offend too many white people.
So, okay, just before I get to my last question, so just to make it so just to be clear, then, so the reason why so many in the abolitionist movement.
Well, again, I don't know that I can agree with you about so many in the abolitionist movement not making the claim that cops don't catch serial killers. I've seen them. Every abolitionist I'm familiar with has made that argument. Likewise, I know about the word copaganda because of the abolition movement.
So you're saying to me you want to correct that many abolitionists don't bring up the facts I brought up
to the contrary, I would say that we wouldn't even know about these things if not for the abolition movement.
Okay.
We might want the abolition movement to be platformed more in mainstream media where they can say these things in mainstream media. But every abolitionist I know has made this argument against the cops catching serial killers. And the only reason that I know the details that I know about the many of the serial killers that have been caught is because abolitionists have shown how bad the cops were at actually catching them and how in many cases the cops actually enabled their careers. Jeffrey Dahmer comes to mind. So, I mean, I can't say abolitionists don't talk about these things because I only know about them because abolitionists talk about them.
Okay.
Now, at the same time, I bemoan the fact that MSNBC doesn't have an abolitionist on Morning Joe explaining why cops are bad. But that's not the abolitionist's fault. That's MSNBC isn't ever going to have an abolitionist on Morning Joe. Unless something else changes that forces them to.
But I find even in left-leaning media and indie media that these things also aren't addressed. And the few the few times abolitionism is addressed, it's mostly from the racial justice angle and not,
Well, now that's a media issue more than it is. That's still a media issue more than it is an abolitionist issue. Every abolitionist I know is talking about this stuff.
Okay.
Even if they don't necessarily talk about it on their show, I know I see Nora Laredo posting about it a whole bunch, so she's clearly talking about it.
Okay.
I know that I post a lot about topics that I don't necessarily get to talk about on my show because my show is a block of time, whereas I post about stuff all the time.
Okay. So Chris has challenged that passionately. Alrighty. Well,
I've also seen Erica Eiffel, who was in mainstream media more recently than some of these other people, make quite a bit of these points about abolitionism, despite necessarily being an abolitionist. And so I think that people are definitely talking about it. I would love to see it more central in more places. I would love to see it platformed more. I do think that there are people who could platform abolitionists more or talk about it more. But the abolitionists are definitely talking about it, and I can't say that they're not.
All righty, interesting. Final question is this. How much would making mental health care part of a single-payer system address so much of the issues we have been discussing?
So I don't know. I would go ahead and go back to the subject of disability rights to say that the mentally ill are more likely to be the victims of crime and abuse than the perpetrators of crime and abuse. Murder victims are more likely to be mentally ill than their killers. Abused children.
Wait. Not because of the trauma of the crime that some may have survived, but actually the predators target them specifically because they are.
Well, someone who's mentally ill is an easier victim than disabled people in general are killed more often than abled people by both cops and violent crime.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Despite the fact that the politics of violent crime centers itself around the fears of white people aren't the people being killed by violent crime in American cities for the most part. Now, are they? The people being punished for the violent crime in America's cities are often the same people being killed by it. And there's a reason for that. And the blame for what white conservatives in their racist splendor call black on black crime is the white state that chooses to make it easier to commit crimes against black people than white people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The police state does not solve the problem of black on black crime the way it solves the problem of white on white or black on white crime. And it does not solve the problem of white on white crime as easily as it solves the problem of black on white crime.
Yeah.
So let's remember all this when some law and order nutso starts talking about black on black crime as some argument against civil rights. No.
And but you definitely find that if we could advance mental health care merging with any existing or new single payer healthcare system, as well as advancing disability rights, that a lot of the issues that we've actually been talking about will be. I
think disability rights are central to the capitalist contradiction, and you can never leave disability rights after anything else.
Yeah.
I think there are some issues, mental health, and honestly, in my opinion, and people will hate me for saying this, mental health and universal health care aren't going to actually solve problems. Instead of creating more, until we solve questions about disability rights that are closely tied to eugenics, because socialized medicine can kill disabled people as effectively as private medicine. I mean, it's not like the National Health Service in the UK or the Medicare system in Canada have great track records for treating disabled people properly.
Yeah.
In fact, the medical advice given to doctors by the National Health Service was killing disabled people at least one at several points in UK history.
So the advancement of left politics, yes, do champion them, but we still have long ways to go to eradicating.
If you're not willing, I mean,
ableism.
ultimately, if you are unwilling to abandon things like racism and queer bashing and misogyny and any other sort of bigoted social prejudice, then you're not going to actually be in solidarity with the oppressed, because there's always somebody you're going to be throwing over the boat.
Yeah.
And if you're throwing people off the boat to make better time, if you're going to make the best time when it's only you on the boat. And now we're back to capitalism.
And with that being said, any final thoughts you want to give on, when it comes to, why you feel prostitution should be legalized and so forth like that?
Decriminalized. Legalized means imposing a regulatory scheme with which workers must comply in order to have their work accepted as legal, which does not free the majority of sex workers from law enforcement interference with their work.
Yeah.
Likewise, decriminalizing the workers but not their customers means that the easiest way for police to catch their customers are by harassing the workers and getting the workers to narc on their customers. And now the workers are criminalized for not cooperating with the police to maintain any customers. Because if you're narking on your customers to the cops, are you going to have customers?
Yeah. And of course, there's also been scandals of there's scandals of the serial killers who the police failed to catch, who purposely targeted sex workers. When we talk about murdered and missing Indigenous women in both Canada and the United States and even Australia, lots of police corruption involved in that. Lots of police are actually involved in murders. Lots of serial killers are involved in that, and lots of serial killers who want to make a career out of it, purposely targeting Indigenous people.
And how many serial killers are cops?
And many of whom, not all, very important to emphasize this, but many murdered and missing Indigenous women are sex workers, but not all.
Of course, and if they're not, they're more likely to be branded as sex workers and therefore not have their cases prioritized by the police because of their marginalized status.
Yeah, and from the research,
all such and such are such and such.
Yeah, and from the research I've done, and again, I say this as someone who has who has listened to some leftists, some feminists who make their case why they are against sex work, and valid arguments, as well as the ones like your voices who have the
every argument against
at least from the research I've done and how we get to an abolitionist world and so forth, all says that you have to decriminalize sex work, and you have to actually make it somewhat legalized because prostitutes are the number one.
I resist support for legalization because legalization usually involves some subordination of sex workers to, I'll go ahead and use the word that people who are against sex work would use, that legalization empowers pimps.
Yeah.
Criminalization also empowers pimps. Decriminalization ends pressures on sex workers themselves, and while it may also benefit buyers and pimps, ultimately it benefits the sex workers themselves more than any other option, and that's what matters. Whereas criminalization and legalization both empower management over labor in specific ways. You can look at Belgium and the Netherlands as examples for how only legalizing sex work in brothels in certain parts of town can lead to brothel owners then expecting that they can just exploit sex workers however they want, unless those sex workers have unions willing to take the brothel owners to court. Now, fortunately, the sex workers in Belgium do have unions and did take the brothel owners to court and won all their demands in court. But, and this is an important but, they had to spend money on lawyers and go to court because of the legalization scheme put in place by the Belgian authorities and the undue power it gave to the owners of the brothels. Mm-hmm. There are certain sorts of pure libertarianism, by which I mean the government doesn't punish anyone, which will in the end always work out to the benefit of the most marginalized, even if the least marginalized get away with something too.
Interesting, yeah.
And I don't like saying that because I am anti-libertarian on many levels in many topics. But in the purest sense of the word libertarian, by which I mean protecting necessary human freedoms and those individual rights that really shouldn't be violated, and that in theory socialism is ultimately supposed to prevent being violated, you know, pure libertarianism is better than selective libertarianism. We just shouldn't ever be libertarian about money, because the more money someone has, the more damage they're doing.
Exactly. And then
we always have to be very, very, very authoritarian about who does and who doesn't have wealth. And by that way, I mean the dictatorship of the proletariat has to take it away from the wealthy and spread it through society.
And final question, because I have to confess I did not like your response, but final question is this. What's it going to take for the broad left movement, people power movements in the U.S. to show more urgent solidarity to the plight of Native Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and Indigenous Alaskans? I'm going to give you a chance to...
Indigenous people at all, for that matter. Yeah. Anywhere. And that, you know, this is that whole white supremacy thing. White supremacy is built on a set of relations between the people who took everything and the people who were living there before, and the people that they brought here to do work for them that they didn't want to do themselves. I'm not even being specific about terms like indigenous and slavery and undocumented labor, because the economic forces manipulating all these things are the same regardless of what form they take. The boss wants to get free labor. And the landlord doesn't want the renter to be able to run away and not pay them.
So it all goes back to none of us are free. None of us are free until we actually have Indigenous liberation.
It's the ultimate class essentialism and class reductionism requires everyone who professes solidarity with the class to actually show solidarity for the most marginalized members of the class.
Yeah.
Not the other way around. Real class reductionism means that white people need to be race traitors. Because if you really are reducing everything to class, you shouldn't care about white people. You should care about your class, even if they're black.
Well, I think that's a fantastic place to end now. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Chris Richards, who is the host of the Eclectic Radical. Check him out. He does a live stream nearly every Sunday at 8 a.m. Oregon time, so adjust your clocks accordingly. And I'll make sure to link to his X, his Substack account, his Patreon, so that if people are interested, you can donate and donate generously. And please do the same for 1+1. Donate to 1+1. Share widely our content and help us grow. Until then, folks, we might have one more show. We might have one more show before we go off on Christmas hiatus. But until then, all my best. Good night and good luck. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy Holidays, and a Happy New Year. And Chris, thank you so much. I hope that this will be the first of many times you come on this program. But if not, folks, you can check me out on the Eclectic Radical, and I even have a playlist of all of my appearances on Chris's program and some of my favorite episodes where I'm not on the show, but it's other fascinating topics going on.
I strongly encourage people to check out the episode Youri and I did that included the late Leslie Lee III for the first about 35 to 40 minutes. That was a really good show that we were all really proud of, myself, Youri, and Leslie. And we had plans and Leslie and I had plans to do it again before he sadly passed. And it's very disappointing, again, that more people weren't listening to voices like Leslie sooner. And that more people who were friends of Leslie's with platforms don't amplify his issues now that he is no longer with us.
And that's exactly why people should check out the work of Chris and help that channel. And please do help that channel grow. And yeah, and Chris, keep doing the great work that you do. However ungrateful it is, however marginalized you get from it, however criminally overlooked it gets, keep doing the great work you do. Hey, I appreciate it. So keep on. So keep on carrying on.
I will keep doing my best, and I appreciate your support and collaboration greatly. I love the work you're doing too.
Thanks, and you have a very Merry Christmas until then. All right.
Merry Christmas.